Greetings to all qualitative scholars who are joining us this time for the colloquium number 3. And today we have interesting speakers, presenters for our colloquium. The first one is Professor Erin York. She has received her Master of, I'm not sure about the MFA, but in fiction and creative non-fiction from Converse University in 2021, and is a PhD candidate in the College of Education at the University of South Carolina. By the way, she is going to defend her dissertation very next month, so we wish her success in her defense. She works and teaches at Converse University at University of South Carolina, where her research centers on 2-year colleges. Sometimes they're also called community colleges, portrayals of higher education in popular culture and arts-based research. She will graduate in May 2022. Next presenter will be Dr. Christine Schott. Dr. Schott holds a PhD in medieval literature from the University of Virginia and an MFA in young adult fiction writing from Converse University. She teaches medieval literature and creative writing at Erskine College in South Carolina. Her book, Canon Fun Fiction, Reading, Writing, and Teaching with Adaptation of Pre-Modern and Early Modern Literature, is forthcoming from an Amsterdam University Press. Both of them will present a topic which is findings as fiction, disrupting traditional methods of research dissemination to consider audiences within and beyond the academia. This is interesting because we're not talking so much about research dissemination. This is probably the first time we are presenting on this topic. So we are happy to welcome both of them to present for AQRA Colloquium. Before we start, I will make an announcement. This is pre-recorded presentations, both of them, because of the time difference, they could not join us live, but they will be happy to receive all the questions that you will raise. So please still post your questions in Q&A box, and we will be happy to discuss them and to relay them to both speakers. Dr. David, we may now start the presentations.
Hello, everyone. My name is E.H. York. You can also call me Erin, and I am co-presenting Findings as Fiction, Disrupting Traditional Methods of Research Dissemination to consider audiences within and beyond the Academy today with my co-author, Christine Schott. You'll see that I have included our emails. We would be more than happy for any of you all to reach out to us. And so my email, I'll go ahead and read it out, is eyork@email.sc.edu. And my affiliation is with the University of South Carolina. There I am a doctoral candidate, and I will be presenting my dissertation actually next month. So that's very exciting. I recently completed my MFA in creative writing in both fiction and creative nonfiction from Converse University, and that was this past spring. And that is actually how Dr. Schott and I know each other. She also completed her MFA at Converse University, and I believe hers is also in fiction and creative nonfiction. And then she is the chair of the Literature and English department at Erskine College. And her email, I'll go ahead and read that out. It's her last name, SCHOTT erskine.edu. And as I said before, we would love to talk more about this with any of you that would be interested. So please do send us an email if you want to consult on a research project, or if you have some ideas from this you'd like to toss around, or if you just have questions potentially about fiction. Because Christine and I do have an emphasis in fiction, in terms of different art methods, that is going to be the focus of this particular talk, but we also are going to touch on some other art forms as well when you're considering different types of dissemination to broader audiences than just the academy with your work. So if you have questions about that, please feel free to reach out as well. And so I would like to say thank you so much to Pavel, who connected us with your organization thanks to the World Qualitative Research Conference, which happened this past January. It was both Dr. Schott and my first time attending the conference, and it was truly incredible to connect with everyone there. And it's even more incredible because we are connecting with you all as well. And I think I speak for both Dr. Schott and myself when I say that we are very much looking forward to this being a continual relationship. So please, once again, contact us. And then without any further ado, I will go ahead and start our presentation. And then because this is a video recording, the second half of the presentation will be done by Dr. Schott. And so you might see a bit of a jump between the section of my recording and then her recording. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. See if we can get this slide to go ahead and move on. There we go. So a little overview of our presentation to start off with. We're going to touch on what exactly is arts-based research, and then we'll go ahead and share two different studies, my study and then Christine's study, and then how we collaborated on this particular project, findings and conclusions. And then once again, if you have those questions, I'll reiterate at the end, please contact us. We really do want to hear from you. So let's go ahead and start off with what exactly is arts-based research as method. So it is a method of conducting qualitative research, which I know is what your organization is involved with. And as a methodologist overall, I would say that I am also a qualitative researcher. And then my emphases within that would be obviously arts-based methods. And then also I'm very interested in narrative inquiry, have worked in autoethnography and ethnography. So that's my background. And then because Christine isn't from the social sciences, she is actually from literature and English, she'll speak more about that methodology and also the discipline when we get into her portion of the presentation. So let's talk about arts-based research with an overview, first of all. So it was in 1993 by Elliot Eisner, who actually termed arts-based research, and it was at a conference for educators at Stanford University. And so we started to see at this point in time that researchers were engaging in this method, but we didn't know exactly what to call it. We didn't know how to term the design. And it definitely had not been solidified within qualitative research as an actual way of conducting inquiry. Also at that same time, or later on, excuse me, we had seen this turn in just conducting research in general, which led us to qualitative and really story-based, looking at those outliers, if we were going to use a quant term, and stopping trying to generalize everything. So this is just a continuation of sort of that fight for legitimacy that qualitative research also faced in establishing itself as method historically. So Eisner was a curriculum theorist, and he was the first to formally suggest the arts could provide rich models for social and behavioral science research. And so since 1993, arts-based research has evolved into, and this is a quote, research that uses the arts in the broadest sense to explore, understand, represent, and even challenge human action and experience. And so of course that sounds very familiar to what we're doing with qualitative research. And arts-based research can incorporate or reach audiences both in and beyond the academy, as well as positively transform participants, community, or society itself. In addition, arts-based research, which you may also see in the literature just as ABR, the abbreviation, allows scholars to question access and academic literacy, as well as reinterpret what researchers view as outcomes and instruments of data collection and even data themselves. And so its designs, as I have mentioned earlier, is literary art or fiction, which is what the focus of our presentation is on. And those were some of the driving features behind why Christine and I both chose arts-based research, because we were interested in these questions of access and academic literacy, particularly since I'm working with our two-year colleges, or community and technical colleges, as they're known as in the States. I was very interested in this idea of community access, because our community and technical colleges are focused in local communities, and they are open access, so anyone can apply. And also we have developmental education, so anyone can learn anything that perhaps they didn't learn in their K through 12 education to be successful in a college environment. And so I looked at the academy and what four-year colleges and universities are doing differently. And I said, wow, I think for this community that I'm doing research with, it's really important for me to consider how my research reaches them. And then in terms of outcomes and instruments of data collection and even data, so I was interested particularly in this idea of outcomes and what happens with our research. So I recently had a chance to go to Puerto Rico on a scholarship and presented my research there. I love the conference environment. I loved getting to attend the World Qual Conference for the first time. I'm involved in several book chapters and other projects so far. And I realized that we get into this rhythm as researchers, and we just sort of go through the motions of preparing to disseminate in ways that feel very familiar to us, and they're known by our communities. But when I start asking people, okay, so your journal has an impact factor of 8 or 11 or whatever it is, what does that mean to the larger community? And when people that you may be conducting research with or on have no access to what you're doing, the project just ends and then potentially we're gone from their lives forever, we're really holding knowledge that's important to these communities hostage from them behind paywalls or in journals that people in the everyday community outside of the academy may never have heard of, or people potentially in different communities of research. You know, our organizations are potentially, we might never have connected if it weren't for Pavel. So those were some of the questions behind what I was doing and what I wanted to consider in my dissemination. And so that brings us to literary art as method. And we're going to come back to constructing research teams. So Stephen Banks in chapter 13, Writing as Theory in Defense of Fiction, points out the practices of fiction writers and nonfiction writers is actually blurry. Researchers and writers enter writing projects with inquiries, driving questions or research questions, and or with a purpose to push for societal change, study societal phenomena, and disseminate to specific audiences. It's just that some of those may be commercial or mass market audiences, whereas we're thinking about, okay, I would like to publish in this top journal in my field. I know that it needs to follow this format, and we write in that way. And so both also can conduct in-depth interviews, historical investigations, legal searches, media content analyses, participant observation, and other similar field work. So you see that these areas are really starting to blur, and the biggest difference behind them is Probably in a work of fiction, you don't see a methodology section. Of course, we have Carolyn Ellis within autoethnography and the ethnographic eye, where of course she does have her methodology section in her novel. That is one example that I wanted to mention. And I would absolutely say go and pick that up if you're looking for this blend of social science research and then also creative writing. And so media content analysis really spoke to me because that was one of the specific methods that I was using for my dissertation. And so I wanted to take that further and learn more about how that would work for translating my academic work into fiction. And so Banks goes on to say for writing to also be research-based, it must include 4 tenets. Writing must be a research practice that is generative in nature. Writing must include or invite critique. Narrative is fundamental. And narrative in the form of literary fiction can be used as scholarship. So there can be a scholarly or a scientific practice in the way that we approach our creative writing or whatever art form that we lay out and we stick to. We may go back and we may need to revise it. This idea of narrative being fundamental is, of course, I think probably anyone who does narrative inquiry probably perked up at that, because of course we're leaning into this storytelling. What is the larger story and themes that we're exploring? Scholarly fiction can be measured in the following ways: by lived truths, which is what we're seeking. We are looking to understand societal phenomenon or the specific lived experiences of our participants. Those may be disguised also in composite characters. We may use different ways to camouflage our participants' anonymity. That's the same as character creation. Another way to measure scientific fiction or scholarly fiction is thematic content that pushes social movements forward through cultural criticism. So we see that in the work of authors such as Margaret Atwood, Samuel Delany, Salman Rushdie, and so on and so forth. And so we're seeing these social movements and this cultural criticism, but it may not be framed necessarily within a theoretical framework that we would use to guide our work. So there may be a general understanding of something like Black Lives Matter, or a general understanding of the movement for pro-life or pro-choice, to give some examples from the United States. And we may not understand necessarily feminist theory or critical race theory, and we may not put it in those terms, but we can still look at these works of fiction and see that there is cultural criticism and there is the movement for social change. And then also, following that up, scholarly fiction will be measured specifically by its theoretical rigor and the presence. So that may not come across in the ways that we think of, okay, we're going to have this section on theoretical frames, but that could come across in an appendix, or it could be built into the novel itself, where a character discovers a theory that changes them. And that very much can be the case when we introduce theory to our participants. So we'll move on from that, and I want to talk a little bit about this idea of constructing research teams quickly, because this is, I think, where some of the fun part comes in. So you can include artists that are either professional or just in your local community. You can include your participants. Maybe some of them have been formally trained in art, or maybe they have indigenous ways of knowing or ways of producing art specific to their communities, and have them construct the art or construct art with them. A great example of that is the article Michael's Story, within which we see the researcher working with a participant to take their hour-and-a-half-long interviews that they conducted while he was attending community college, and it's turned into this gorgeous poem. So again, that's Michael's Story, and I would absolutely recommend that everyone look that up. And you can also be the artist of your own work. So of course, we see that in the case of my colleague Christine's work, as well as my own work that we'll get into when we talk about our studies. And artists are not necessarily formally trained in their mediums. And that's something that Stephen Banks and others who have talked about arts-based research like to emphasize. Much of formal training for art actually focuses on the history behind any given form. And so of course that's important, but equally important is craft. And an MFA program, certainly you're going to be trained in craft, but in an art history degree, for example, you're not going to be doing a lot of art, you're going to be learning the history of art. And so there are other ways to learn craft knowledge, including online resources, free resources, library classes, library books, and local organizations. They're probably writing organizations. And so joining those, you'll have speakers brought in and they'll talk about different elements of craft. And in fact, before I received my MFA, I have been writing for more than 10 years and publishing creatively, and I didn't have formal training. And so then you can also include how you will disseminate in non-traditional ways as one of your questions of inquiry at the start of your research project. So that was my third research question, was how is the work that I'm doing, which is important to this community, which is not engaged in the academy that the way that we think of four-year colleges and universities, absolutely engaged in higher education and post-secondary learning and all of those other elements. However, we have different populations coming in that don't speak this language of research. And so this way, if you're considering how you're going to construct your research team or how you're going to include art at the very beginning, you are going to fold your dissemination into every stage of your research project. And so maybe you get halfway through and realize, okay, we need to revisit this method. We need to see how we're going to do things a little bit differently. And you can do that then. Perhaps you were going to do a museum exhibit and the venue fell through. So perhaps at that point, you look at your local university or a technical college or something like that and move your museum display there. And so the amazing thing about this was I found myself viewing the world in a very different and exciting way. My audience felt a lot larger. I felt jarred out of that. Just the grind of how we typically translate our work into presentations and then publications within the academy. And it was very exciting to think about this and to think about who from my literary community can I bring into this project to make sure that it has that critique, the invited critique. So I joined a small writing group of several other published authors. And so I'm working with them outside of my dissertation committee on different elements of the story. And so now let's specifically get into how we use art in research, because there are three different types. And we're going to use the word literature here as synonymous with literary art or creative writing instead of like conducting literature review. So research into literature and design, including historical research, research into a variety of theoretical perspectives on art and design, aesthetic, or perceptual research. So that's where we're going back to that idea of absolutely, you can engage in that formal training that focuses on the history behind the art form. So that would be the first one. Secondly, would be research through literature and design, including materials research, developmental work, and action research. And so this could be, definitely you would see this folded into the stage of how am I going to include, art within my question of inquiry. What material can I use? I want to understand how to use a museum venue or construct a museum display. And then also action research, that could be participatory action research and inviting your community in. And then there's also research for literature and design. So that refers to projects in which reflection is embodied in the process of creating, where the end product is an artifact meant to communicate knowledge visually, iconically, and imaginatively. And so this was very much what I would say Christine and I both engaged in. So we have an artifact, it's a work of fiction that is communicating our knowledge. And additionally, reflection is embodied in the process of creating. In my case, I kept analytic memos. And so I was able to reflect on that process and use that as a learning tool as well for findings. So now let's move on to my study. So again, this is from my dissertation. And I was looking at two-year colleges in media and popular culture. So historically, two-year colleges, community technical college, you may hear them called state colleges, and they may also just be known as colleges. In the States, have received mixed representations in media and popular culture. So again, I was engaging in a media analysis. And this ranges from hearing that these two-year colleges are the key to democratic higher education in America. They are the key to social mobility. And then we also have these farcical images of two-year colleges as fake college, or they're just an extension of high school, which is part of the argument for free college in America. And additionally, we have even had Donald Trump, former occupant of the White House, saying that two-year colleges are joke schools. So we're seeing at all of these different levels from Hollywood and then also from the White House formerly, that two-year colleges are less than, that they shouldn't even exist. And so when we compare these representations to the plethora of four-year colleges and universities that are shown in media and pop culture, which there are thousands of representations of four-year colleges and universities, where we see two-year colleges are sorely underrepresented, first of all, and then secondly, the way they are represented is incredibly problematic, and that's partially due to the vulnerable populations and the populations that have been marginalized by society, who are impacted by this discourse. So one example of the caricatures of the two-year college in media is the show Community, which you see a graphic up on the slide of. And part of my dissertation looked at what has happened to the two-year college since Community debuted on the air and ran for 6 seasons. And what we see is that, one, there are an increasing number now of two-year colleges in the media, but two, they continue to lack representation when compared to four-year institutions. And Community really gave sitcoms especially the formula to portray two-year colleges. And it's through a very problematic light. And now we just continue to see this perpetuated in sitcoms. And also we've seen that in the fiction that's come out as well. So Community, what did it do? It solidified Hollywood's image of two-year colleges as the joke schools. And so we see them now with the same line of humor. Bumbling characters, misfit characters bumble at these two-year colleges, which are bumbling in and of themselves. And examples include Modern Family, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, Parks and Recreation, The Conners, Schitt's Creek, and many other sitcoms. And so you'll notice some of these sitcoms are still on the air today. However, for the past 5 years, research on this area has stalled. There has not been a publication looking at this since 2017. So clearly it was time for someone to look at this again. There has also only been one scholarly book that looked at this, and it was called Storytellers, and it was by Nancy LaPaglia. I would highly recommend it if you're interested in this cultural phenomenon. And then I applied a theoretical lens, and I chose critical race theory. And I specifically wanted to use intersectionality through Kimberly Crenshaw's writing. And then I wanted to use counter storytelling, but I wanted to use this idea of storytelling very literally. in that idea of fiction. And so I use this as the frame to interrogate the two-year colleges that are on the margins in media and pop cultures. And then I wanted to decenter how we look at four-year colleges and universities, particularly. It's not only in how they're portrayed in mass market media, but also how we talk about them within our own environment. And I was leaning into the community cultural wealth at two-year colleges and looking at open access, community centeredness through entirely different lights when I was considering dissemination. And again, I'm going to say how we at four-year colleges and universities hold knowledge hostage from these larger populations. And that leads to producers of false knowledges like Hollywood. They're telling stories, and those stories are bought as, I don't have information about this, so I'm going to glean this knowledge from this movie, from this book. And we as researchers, we are conducting research. We have lived truths to share with the world. And we're doing ourselves just as large of an injustice as we are the larger community when we don't consider taking advantage of mass market or art, giving back to our communities through, I keep going back to museum displays because we just completed one very recently, but podcasts, TV shows, all of those are ways that we can also communicate our knowledges. And so, let me go ahead and talk about my dissertation because I realize I'm running out of time. So let me talk more about my study. So the critical questions were, how does media and popular culture portray two-year colleges, which we've talked about? How can counter storytelling in the form of fiction embrace two-year colleges' community cultural wealth, instead of coming at them from these deficit-based perspectives, which are couched in humor, in Hollywood and other images? And then also, how can the study reach audiences in and beyond the academy? And so that's where, when I talked about folding a question of inquiry about dissemination into your critical questions, this is an example. And the previous research, which of course we haven't heard anything for the past 5 years on this topic, but the previous research that I was using for my literature review had this call to action for researchers, educators, insiders of two-year colleges to not be victim to the media and to use the media to communicate the real image of community colleges while challenging the inaccurate real image. And so since this 2007 study, there had been 10 more years of research on this topic, but none of them had taken up this challenge. And we see this in LaPaglia's 1994 text. We see this in other aspects of, I think there's even in 2014, we see this call to action from Making Meaning of the Real, which was a dissertation on this topic. But none of them take that extra step to actually do this work, to challenge the real image. And we can do that through art. And so that was the purpose of my dissertation. I wanted to analyze the existing portrayals of two-year colleges and review the previous studies. I found that there was a large gap in the literature, and there was a lot of media to review. Obviously, I mean, really over the past 10 years, I looked at different images of the two-year colleges, which led to my findings about there are more images of the community college. However, they're following this problematic formula that we see. And so what could I do? I could look at the existing literature and say, wow, okay, there's so much great stuff here where we see these students and educators who are insiders in the two-year colleges, and they are describing the community cultural wealth in X, Y, and Z way. And I wanted to use that and bring that in and portray that through fiction, portray these stories through fiction, and therefore also be able to challenge the deficit-based narratives. And so I realize I'm really running out of time now. And I want you all to be able to engage with Christine's work as well. And so some of the deficit-based narratives, just very quickly, were lack of representation, as we talked about. We see low-performing students, negligent faculty and staff who just want to escape the two-year setting. We have white savior-like cis hetero male characters as the lead. Two-year colleges as joke or fake school. Humor employed by writers to mask harmful stereotypes. We see inappropriate faculty and staff, or faculty and student relationships, lack of resources. We see characters who have marginalized identities portrayed in ways that reinforce harmful stereotypes, and so on and so forth. So that's what exists. And so here's how I pushed back through my novel, which I wrote in chapter 4 of my dissertation. So some of those included higher education with an emphasis on access for all rather than access for few, affordable tuition and programs, proximity and relationship to local communities, support for and service to marginalized populations in America, which can lead to social mobility and societal change, helping to handle the increasing number of Americans who sought post-secondary education, particularly over the period of the two world wars, which four-year institutions could not handle that influx of students. Faculty who are focused on teaching without the additional burden of research and service commitments. And sometimes we see faculty who their emphasis is on research. It is not on teaching. They were never educated to be teachers. We see a difference in that at four-year or two-year institutions. Building community and campus unity, transfer and articulation agreements to four-year colleges and universities. So we see very well-prepared students entering four-year colleges and universities. And we have job and career preparation. And also there's the ability to maintain jobs and family life while also attending college. So we don't just end up in these little bubbles for 4 years and then we go into the larger world again. And so I embraced all of these in my novel Inlet, which was chapter 4 of my dissertation, as I stated. And so really what I was trying to do was take this literature and research that had been done that was so valuable and find ways to translate it to larger audiences, and at the same time really disrupt what Hollywood was showing us. And so employing art was necessary to filling the gap in the literature. And I came to the conclusion while I was engaged in this work from my analytic memos that no piece of popular culture and no study can ever fully comprehend the lived experience of one person, let alone a community or an organization or a societal phenomenon. However, this can start a research trend, and we can have other researchers that are interrogating similar things that we are and trying to fill those research gaps, who can do it better than we did. And they can take our literature and use that to inform their work. We're blending science and art. A lot of people are just frankly turned off by the idea of science, but they love engaging in different forms of art. With Netflix, people will sit and binge 2 seasons of a television show in a weekend. I mean, guilty. So art is changing society. It always has. And our research is capable of changing society as well. And I would argue it has changed society. And this is a way to consider our communities, our participants as very valuable and vital to this process of how we understand the world. And we can use art as a means to bridge the gap between our universities and larger communities. And that's something that the two-year colleges have always known. And they have been constructed with that exactly in mind. And so this study was an amazing, life-changing process for me. And thank you for letting me share it with you all. I will let Christine go ahead and share her study with you, and then she will wrap everything up with our conclusions. So thank you again.
I'm coming at this subject from the perspective of a literary scholar. The field of literary research, with a few exceptions, is almost entirely qualitative in nature, though we think of qualitative differently than data-based researchers do. Our field is probably closer akin to philosophy than it is to the hard or social sciences. It is about generating ideas and interpreting literary evidence based on those ideas. The general procedure is this. A researcher already grounded in the field's discourse encounters a piece of literature and identifies in that literature a particular set of evidence to analyze, then applies secondary research to the primary source in order to generate that analysis. Secondary research might include sources written by other scholars on the same piece of literature, or it might consist of using one or more theoretical approaches as a lens for understanding the primary material. The scholar would then write an article making an argument that synthesizes those findings. Or they might let those same findings form the background for a piece of newly written fiction. And what is probably self-evident is that the piece of fiction would undoubtedly have a larger audience than the scholarly article. For the example I'm going to share today, I will be drawing on material from my book, Canon Fan Fiction, forthcoming from Amsterdam University Press. Medieval Iceland produced a large body of prose literature, both the novel-length sagas and the short stories known as Þættir. The story of Thorstein Oxfoot is an example of the short story genre, the tale of a young Icelander who overcomes his unpromising origins, battles ogres and the undead, and becomes a favorite of King Olaf Tryggvason, the leader of Norway's conversion to Christianity. As a scholar studying and translating this story into English, I was interested in Thorstein's mother, Oddny, who is mute. Because she is unable to speak, Oddny can register no verbal protest when her brother essentially gives her to Ivar, his Norwegian house guest, who then rapes her and disavows the son, Thorstein, who is born as a result. I was interested in analyzing the character of Oddny through the lenses of feminism and disability studies, which results in an intersectional study, looking at the combined effect of multiple identity categories. I would like to look at two short scenes from Thorstein Oxfoot, one from the beginning of Oddny's story and one from the end of it. The first is when Oddny's brother tells Oddny that he wants her to make herself available to his house guest, Ivar. This is how the scene plays out in the original. One day, Thorkel went to talk with Oddny, his sister, and told her that the captain had come to his home. I would like, he said, for you to wait on him this winter, sister, because most of the other people around here are working. Oddny carved runes on a stick because she couldn't talk, and Thorkel took it and looked at it. The stick read, "I'm not inclined to put myself into the service of the captain, because my heart tells me if I do serve Ivar, much evil will come of it." Thorkel grew very angry when Oddny refused, and when she saw that, she stood up and went inside and began to serve Ivar, and she kept to it all winter. Two things interested me about this scene. First, Thorkel is willing to sacrifice his sister's happiness in order to forge connections with his famous guest, indicating that homosocial political bonding outranks personal feelings with Thorkel. Second, the narrative gives Oddny a way of making those feelings perfectly clear through carving runes on a stick, but Thorkel ignores them anyway. It seemed to me, from a realist and historical perspective, that a person like Oddny, who could not speak, would absolutely find ways of communicating, especially to someone she knows as well as she knows her brother, and that rune stick simply serves as a narrative tool for making that communication visible. But, significantly, a person who cannot speak, whether she carves her feelings into wood or indicates them using signs or facial expressions, is easy to ignore. For Thorkel, not listening to Oddny is as easy as turning his back on her. The fact that Oddny is a woman increases the complexity of her inability to speak. Although the life of women in medieval Iceland was less constrained than in many other parts of Europe, they had, for example, the right to divorce and the right to own property, the sagas in Þættir still make it clear that women who talked too much were seen as troublemakers. Often, the feuds that make the sagas famously tragic are begun by quarreling wives. Verbal restraint on the part of a woman was seen as desirable, and when a woman did speak up, the men around her were under no obligation to heed her, as Thorkel makes clear. Thus, Oddny's mutism, from a feminist perspective, is almost symbolic of her position as a woman in a patriarchal society. All of these theoretical insights could be expressed in an academic paper analyzing mutism and femininity in the story of Thorstein Oxfoot, but they could equally find expression in a work of fiction. Instead of writing an article, I retold the story from Odni's point of view instead of Thorkel's. Here is my version of the scene in which Odni's brother pressures her into making herself available to Ivar. It is set in the horse stable outside the main hall. "How do you like our guests?" Thorkel asked casually. She gave him a look. "Don't be impossible," he laughed. "Ivar is a great man in Hordaland." She gestured at the dark landscape around them, but she wasn't sure he understood that she meant, "This isn't Hordaland." "Listen," Thorkel said, picking a piece of hay from the forelock of his mare who had come over to greet him. "I want you to take care of Ivar this winter." She looked at him in surprise, and he would not meet her gaze. "It's only good hospitality," he said. "We wouldn't want to insult him." When she continued to stare at him, he sighed and finally turned toward her. "Look, Odni, he's a wealthy man. If he should ask for your hand, it would be a lucky thing for you. You don't want to turn into some wrinkled old careling and never marry, do you?" He tried to laugh, but Odni wasn't laughing. She could see his frustration mounting. "Be reasonable, Odni," he said. "He's handsome as well as wealthy. What more could you possibly want?" She glared, and Thorkel's temper flared up fast, as it always did when he was crossed. "Do what you want," he said, "but do it under your own roof. If you don't like the way I run my own household, find your own." He turned on his heel and stomped off. She watched him disappearing into the dark. She had nowhere to go if Thorkel cast her out. Taking a deep breath and smoothing the front of her dress like a fighter checking his armor before battle, she went back into the hall and refilled Ivar's cup. By exploring Odni's actions through fiction, I was able to draw out the historical realities surrounding the motives of both characters. Thorkel wants to gain an important ally by impressing Ivar, but he also hopes to secure a marriage for his sister, whose muteness mars her eligibility. Likewise, Odni complies not because she agrees with Thorkel or even because she's afraid of him, but because, as a woman, she has limited options for supporting herself if she is cast out of her family home. My second example comes from the end of Odni's story. Her 10-year-old son Thorstein, in battling an army of the undead, has just won a piece of gold that can magically restore speech to a mute person. This is all that is said in the original. Thorstein reported all the events and gave his mother the gold, and she received her speech when it was placed under the root of her tongue. The tone of this sentence, though restrained, is clearly positive. The paragraph in which it appears is a celebration of the young Thorstein's accomplishments. But a disabilities study approach would ask readers of this scene to question whether Odni wanted to be cured, whether the desire to eliminate disability might come more from the non-disabled than from the disabled themselves. After all, it is perfectly clear in the original story that Odni is able to run a household, spin and sew, comprehend complex discourse, and even, as we have seen, communicate her feelings, though others generally ignore her. The story is also content to accept magic as the means by which Odni regains her speech. However, if we posit a medical explanation for her muteness, her cure also becomes a matter of ordinary rather than magical things. As a thought experiment, we might hypothesize that Odni had Broca's aphasia, which renders a speaker not mute, but unable to communicate in clear sentences. It would be discouraging to try to make oneself understood by a community of non-disabled speakers who would have been given to mocking the telegraphic speech patterns of someone with Broca's aphasia, and one might conceivably give up the attempt. Such a condition would explain why Odni could suddenly produce speech after being given the gold. It was a decision, not magic. This is my version of the scene in which Thorstein gives his mother the piece of gold. "But here's the best part, Mother," Thorstein went on. "Brynjar told me that if someone can't speak, if they put this gold under their tongue, they'll be able to talk again. Try it, Mother, try it." The men were all looking at her now, and she was surprised to see that they were waiting for her to do as he said. She looked back down at her son, eager to fix her, eager to give her what she did not have. She sighed and put the coin in her mouth. It tasted of old earth and children's sweat, of the despair of the dead and the hope of the young. "Well?" Thorstein asked breathlessly. "Do you feel any different?" How she wanted to lie to him and say everything had changed. How she wished he didn't think she was broken. She thought for a long moment, tasting the metal on her tongue, before she very carefully framed her mouth to form the word "no." The sound was rough and hoarse, but it was unmistakably a word. It was a word she had said hundreds of times in dozens of ways, with mouth, face, eyes, and hands, and had never been heard. She wondered if they would hear her now. I don't need to provide the rest of the scene for you to know that they don't, nor do they notice that she hardly ever speaks thereafter. They would likely not have listened if she had. As scholars, we learned several things from presenting our analyses in this way. First, writing fiction was much more engaging and memorable than writing an academic paper, and if that is true for writing it, then it is surely even more true for reading it. While an academic journal may have circulation in the hundreds, mostly to academic libraries to which only a select population has access, fiction, especially novels, can circulate in the hundreds of thousands and be accessible to anyone with a library card. Second, writing fiction is more flexible in terms of content than academic writing. While no essay on a piece of literature could engage in more than 2 or 3 themes or theoretical lenses, the nature of fiction enables the writer to comment on economics, race, feminism, disability, intersectionality, and a dozen other subjects at various points in the narrative without losing coherence. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, fiction trusts its readers to interpret the material for themselves. Not every reader engages deeply in the material they read, as many of us who assign scholarly articles in the classroom know. But for those who are willing, reading fiction allows them to recognize for themselves, for instance, the unjust assumptions made about Audney because she is both female and mute, or about two-year colleges in the meritocratic system of America's higher education. Putting the power of that realization in their own hands makes it more meaningful than simply reading the message explicitly in an academic article. We know that we remember only about 10% of what we read, but 90% of what we do. Presenting the findings of research in the form of fiction empowers readers to engage more actively in the practice of interpretation, allowing them in a way to do the very work we, as scholars, are doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those presentations. Although the researchers who presented are not with us, but I believe we will discuss the questions and answers that they will provide next time. But I should admit, the first time I can hear such an interesting way of presenting the findings. And this is what I like about qualitative research. It can be done and presented in many ways, because as we understand, research in a sense, it is a way of communication. We communicate the issues that we find we're addressing to the audience that needs to know, to be aware of some problems. So I would like to ask my colleagues now, what do you think about this approach of arts-based research? Is it possible to blend the seemingly different strange worlds of arts and science, to blend together into meaningful communication to the bigger audience? What do you think? Well, it's just a discussion among us now, but we will definitely relay those questions to our...
Yes, I think it's good to engage, even though briefly, about what we have heard, although we have 3 very good questions here. And yeah, asked by Dr. Gabashani and also BJ Olitris. These are really good questions, and please expect that we will post the answers in our FB page and also provide a discussion next meeting before we start. But what I would like to say is, this is a trend now in qualitative research, which we would like to bring also to Asia. And that is the use of arts-based approach to research. And I want to say that arts can be used in all stages or in any stage of the research. What is commonly done is to use arts for data generation. Like in the case of Photo Voice, we ask our participants to take photos, to explain to us the meaning of photos. Hence, we have our data generated through arts. But what our speakers now are telling us, this is pushing to the next level, and that is to disseminate our findings through arts. And this is common in studies such as narrative inquiry, for example, where the output of narrative inquiry can be, letter A, a narrative portrait of each participant, which can be published as a book in itself. So if you have, shall we say, 10 participants, you can have chapter 1 for participant 1, chapter 2. So you have a total of already 10 chapters. Yes, so that can be published separately as a book. And in this way, what our speakers are saying, that there will be more accessibility to our findings. You see, the community, the masses cannot gain access to the journal articles that we write. And also when you write a journal article, we speak in such a language that is not easy to understand. I don't know why that is. I hope that we can speak in a scholarly way, but our elementary students can understand. I think that should be our goal. And so narrative inquiry can have narrative portrait as an output, can have poetic portrait as an output. And this one are, in this way, this is non-fiction, but still it is creative writing. But what they did is using fiction so they fictionalized, their findings and deliver their findings in the form of a novel, yeah, or in a form of a short story. I have read, actually I attended a presentation. This was done in New Zealand during the Women Leading Education Across the Continent conference. There was a presenter there which she performed her findings through a dance. Yes, so I think it was an autoethnography, a study on herself. I cannot remember very clearly, but it's about her, and I think her personal life and dealing, I think maybe being a professor, being a mother, like that. And she performed a dance. Yes. So this is our thrust, and hopefully AQRA can continue promoting this one, the use of arts in every stage of research.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Selim. Yes, I believe we have interesting questions, but we will allow the researchers, the presenters to answer them.
Mm-hmm.
So next time we will have a special part to answer those questions.
Mm-hmm.
So for now, we'll probably move to the next point of our program. Dr. Graysel, over to you.
Yes, Dr. Graysel, yeah, we will now show, this is just briefly, Dr. Pavel, just our certificate.
Yes, certificates,
Mm-hmm.
yes. We are proud to give the certificate to Professor Erin York for her valuable service as a resource speaker on the topic findings as fiction, disrupting traditional methods of research, dissemination to consider audiences within and beyond the academy. We will send the certificates to our speakers, and another certificate we will also give to, maybe we can send.
Yes, to Christine.
So, yeah, the next one is Dr. Christine Schott, also for her presentation. So we are happy to have them today for our colloquium. Thank you.